Okay, we are still studying wow moments in the story of Jesus. I think we have 3 more lessons before Mark takes over the Sunday morning class. Don't look at me like that. We done talked about that. And this, hopefully this morning, is our last lesson on the Sermon on the Mount. We've spent a lot of time on the Sermon on the Mount. I think it's beneficial, very beneficial, but hopefully we finish up today.
Danny, let me say something real quick. That I should have said something about it, but my test all came out good. I passed, and I studied real hard, and when I finally got the test results back, they're all good.
They're all good.
Yes. I'm sorry to interrupt you, but
you still got the symptoms?
Some.
Well, it ain't all good then.
Well, those tests are good. I don't know what else is going on, but them tests are good.
Okay, good deal. I've said it, we're talking about the Sermon on the Mount, year 2 of Jesus' ministry, and this is part 7. I've said it repeatedly as we talked about the Sermon on the Mount, and I'll say it one more time. This teaching of Jesus is truly revolutionary, and it's transformational, if we will certainly heed it. To his disciples, it stood in opposition to the traditional teachings concerning the Mosaic Law, especially as taught by the scribes and the Pharisees. And to us today, it stands in opposition to the prevailing attitudes of the world around us. As Christians, we certainly need to be different than those around us. We need to be distinct. We need to be peculiar people. And the people around us are certainly in need of being influenced by our holy example, at least what we hope is our holy example. Now, the remainder of the Sermon on the Mount presents 2 choices, each having opposite outcomes that everyone is called upon to make. It does this by using a series of 4 contrasting comparisons. And that first comparison we're going to look at this morning is the 2 ways. And that's found in Matthew 7, 13 and 14, and Luke 13, 24. Pretty much will be in Matthew. So in this first comparison, Jesus talks about 2 ways. Matthew 5, 13 through 14 says, "Enter by the narrow gate, for wide is the gate, and broad is the way that leads to destruction, and there are many who go in by it. Because narrow is the gate, and difficult is the way which leads to life, and there are few who find it." Wow. Jesus instructs us to enter by the narrow gate, which is the entrance into the way that leads to an eternal home in heaven. Interestingly enough, Acts 9 and verse 2, Christians were first called those of the way. Jesus describes the gate as narrow and not readily found. And the way is described as difficult, so difficult that only a few will find it. Now, in opposition to the narrow gate, there is also a wide gate that is easily found, and many will enter into that gate. Those entering that wide gate will find its way is broad, easily traveled, and it's going to be crowded. The broad way, however, is the way that leads to eternal death and destruction. Now, if we put this in context, in the context of Jesus' day, his time, it was his way that was presented as that which was difficult. And it was the way of the Pharisees and the scribes which was presented as that which was broad or easy. Now, although Jesus does not mention it here, we should note that it is possible to change which way you are traveling. Deciding to leave the difficult way and entering into the broad way, now that's relatively easy. All you need to do is relinquish Jesus as your Lord and begin following the ways of the world. Deciding to leave the broad way for the difficult way would seem to be a little bit harder transition. It requires more effort and thought, and it requires a great amount of determination in making Jesus the Lord of one's life after having experienced the ways of the world. But the reward of the narrow way will be great for everyone who makes that decision. Any comments on those couple of verses? Okay, let's look at the fruit of two trees. Matthew 7:15 through 20 and Luke 6:43 through 45. Now in this second contrasting comparison, Jesus talks about the fruit of two trees. And let's notice Matthew 7:15 through 16, where Jesus begins with these introductory remarks. He says, "Beware of false prophets who come to you in sheep's clothing, but inwardly they are ravenous wolves. You will know them by their fruits. Do men gather grapes from thorn bushes or figs from thistles?" Now, as a transition from the two ways to the fruit of two trees, Jesus begins by saying, beware of false prophets. In other words, don't be led astray into that broad way that he's just talked about by these false prophets. False teachers may appear to be as harmless as doves or lambs, but they are as bloodthirsty as wolves. So how do we know whether a prophet is true or false? Well, the true test of a prophet, or of a teacher for that matter, is the conformity of his teaching to the doctrine that we find in Scripture. We can know them, in other words, we can judge them by their fruits. We must be discerning enough of their teaching to not be taken in by their falsehoods and their deceptions. Grapes, he says, cannot come from thorn bushes, or figs from thistles. And that's a wild statement, a very logical statement, but a wild statement indeed. Now notice Matthew 7:17 through 20. "Even so, every good tree bears good fruit, but a bad tree bears bad fruit. A good tree cannot bear bad fruit, nor can a bad tree bear good fruit. Every tree that does not bear good fruit is cut down and thrown into the fire. Therefore, by their fruits you will know them." So the good tree and the bad tree are contrasted in relation to the fruit which they produce. A good tree will consistently produce good fruit. But a bad tree, its normal consistent production is going to be bad. And the fruit, whether good or bad, will provide evidence of whether or not that person is of God. The good tree will continue to produce good fruit, but the tree that does not bear good fruit is cut down, according to the reading. It's cut down and cast into the fire, which is a picture of the eternal punishment in hell for those that do not produce good fruit. So the production of fruit in the life of Christians will obviously vary. We know that. We've seen other teachings of Jesus. It'll vary based upon their individual talents and their opportunities. Some may produce 100-fold, some 60, some 30. Yet, no Christian has the option of producing no fruit at all. And I think that's a wild statement for all of us. But Jesus knows our talents and our opportunities, and he's going to we're going to be judged, of course, by how we take advantage of those. So maybe we all be willing to do what we can for our Lord, do everything that we can, produce that good fruit. Any comments? Yes.
Verse 16, verse 16 and verse 20 standing as a further explanation or expansion of what Jesus said in verse 1 and 2 of this chapter.
Okay.
Judge not that you be not judged, for with what judgment you judge, you will be judged. With what measure you mete, it will be measured to you again. Versus, you will know them by their fruit. Mm-hmm. And so it's a clarification of the matter of judge not. Judge not is not an absolute statement. It is a statement of, you better be careful about judging, but you can judge by their fruit. In fact, we are expected to be inspectors.
Yeah.
We are fruit inspectors. We can tell, like, for instance, people ask me, how many people stay faithful in India when you baptize folks? And our retention rate is somewhere between 70 and 80%. And what's that based on? It's based on church attendance. Yeah, I can't tell what their heart is. We can't tell what's in their heart, but we can see when they're in church. And so the idea is you judge by their fruit, not by their, because we're not allowed to judge the heart. Only God can do that.
Right. We're not capable of doing that. Exactly. Okay, any other comments? Okay. Let's look at two types of professions. Professions are like confessions coming from the mouth. That's what we're talking about here. And that's found in Matthew 7:21 through 23, Luke 6:46, and Luke 13:26 through 27. Now in this third contrasting comparison, Jesus talks about two different kinds of professions concerning the lordship of Jesus. In Matthew 7:21 through 23, Jesus says this, "Not everyone who says to me, 'Lord, Lord,' shall enter the kingdom of heaven, but he who does the will of my Father in heaven. Many will say to me in that day, 'Lord, Lord, have we not prophesied in your name, cast out demons in your name, and done many wonders in your name?' And then I will declare to them, 'I never knew you. Depart from me, you who practice lawlessness.'" Wow. Jesus says that the verbal acknowledgement of his lordship by itself is insufficient to allow someone to enter into the kingdom of heaven. If we want to enter into the kingdom of heaven, we must actually make Jesus the Lord of our lives and actively do his will, do what he tells us to do, which is also the Father's will. The Lord's will, Jesus' will is the Father's will. When the penitent believer is baptized into Christ and he faithfully dedicates his life to obeying his Lord's every command, only then can he claim the hope of a heavenly home. Amazingly, Jesus says that many who had prophesied, many who had even cast out demons, many who had done wonderful works in his name were never recognized or known by the Lord. In fact, Jesus says they were practicing lawlessness. And again, that is a wow statement. Now, how is it possible that they had all these powers and yet they were never saved? The Lord was never the Lord of their lives. Notice the reading in, if you want to turn to 1 Corinthians 13. 1 Corinthians 13, 1 through 3, I think gives us a little insight into this. It says, "Though I speak with the tongues of men," I've got it up on the board too, if you want to look there. "Though I speak with the tongues of men and of angels, but have not love, I have become sounding brass or a clanging symbol. And though I have the gift of prophecy and understand all mysteries and all knowledge, and though I have all faith so that I could remove mountains, but have not love, I am nothing. And though I bestow all my goods to feed the poor, and though I give my body to be burned, but have not love, it profits me nothing. You know, externally it says we may be doing what the Lord commands us to do. And yet our heart is not right before God. We go through the motions of obedience, but we are not motivated by a love for God or for a love for our fellow man. Without love, I am nothing, and my obedience profits me nothing. And definitely that is a wow statement. That should be an eye-opening reality, and it should motivate us to be more attentive, loving, and compassionate to all those with whom we come into contact. I think this it's tough to understand how they could have all these powers, and yet Jesus saying that he never knew them. It's amazing. Any comments? Okay, let's look at two foundations. Matthew 7, 24 through 27, and Luke 6, 47 through 49. This is the fourth and final contrasting comparison. Jesus talks about two different kinds of foundations. Jesus describes the first kind of foundation in Matthew 7, 24 through 25. He says, "Therefore, whoever hears these sayings of mine and does them, I will liken him to a wise man who built his house on the rock. And the rain descended, the floods came, and the winds blew and beat on that house, and it did not fall, for it was founded on the rock." Wow. Jesus is completing his longest recorded sermon, and he has said some extremely revolutionary things which transcend the teaching of the scribes and Pharisees. And he admonishes his audience to heed and to do the things that he has instructed, and to make that instruction the foundation of how they live their lives. If they will build their lives on this rock of instruction, when the storms of life come, the rains, the floods, the winds, when those storms come, they will never cause us to fall. And that's the first foundation. We need to build on the solid rock. Now the second foundation is described in Matthew 7, 26 through 27. It says, "But everyone who hears these sayings of mine and does not do them will be like a foolish man who built his house on the sand. And the rain descended, the floods came, and the winds blew and beat on that house, and it fell, and great was its fall." Jesus warns his audience not to be foolish by refusing to obey his instruction. Jesus describes a foolish man as one who hears his instruction, refuses to comply with those instructions, and instead builds his house on a foundation of sand, a foundation based on worldliness or worldly principles. And when the storms of life come, those same rains and floods and winds that beat upon the house that was on the rock and it didn't fall, those same storms will come upon that house and it will fall, because it's founded on the sand and not upon the rock of Jesus' instruction. And it ends by saying, "And great was its fall." Great was its fall. Wow. Any comments before we kind of end up?
The Bible says, "Fearful things fall in the hands of the living God."
Okay, it's a terrible thing to fall into the hands of a living God. Yes, there is. We think of God as a loving God, but he has wrath too upon those who do not obey him.
And those scriptures right there remind me of, when I go through, been through the open heart surgery and the cancer. And my faith was so strong when I went through the open heart surgery. And then they told my kids that I may not make it through the night. I didn't know all that. But my focus was on God, and it was on Jesus. And I could just see him sitting at the foot of my bed. And so I really believe that if we put our foundation on the rock, we can get through anything.
Yep, absolutely. Thank you. Okay, this ends Jesus' Sermon on the Mount. How well did the multitude of people receive the sermon? Matthew 7:28 and 29 says, "And so it was, when Jesus had ended these sayings, that the people were astonished at his teaching, for he taught them as one having authority, and not as the scribes." Notice that the people were astonished at his teaching. Why? Because he taught them as one having authority, it says. And wow, that was different than what they were used to hearing. Obviously, the instruction of Jesus was so very far beyond what the scribes were teaching the people. The scribes were supposed to be the theologians of their day, but they had to rely upon the law. And in particular, they were relying a lot on the traditions that they had developed through the years for their authority. Jesus, however, was his own authority, and it became readily apparent in the depth, the force, and the revolutionary nature of his message. Rather than quoting the opinions of tradition, Jesus spoke as if he personally knew what he was talking about, because he did. And without a doubt, the Pharisees were disturbed by the authority with which Jesus taught, as well as the popularity that he was creating among the common people. Before we continue, we should note that the Sermon on the Mount was recorded by Matthew using 3 chapters and 111 verses, which compares to Luke using a partial chapter and 30 verses. Obviously, Matthew gives us a more detailed account of the sermon than Luke. But I hope you've noticed as we've gone along that Luke also gives instruction in other places rather than Luke chapter 6, which simply means that the instruction found in the Sermon on the Mount was instruction that was significant enough to be repeated over and over and over. No doubt Jesus did that. But thankfully we have this Sermon on the Mount recorded. Any comments before we go on? Yes.
Jesus spoke to a specific... Jesus had a specific group of people there, but that's not all the people he taught while he was on the earth.
Right.
Everywhere he went, he taught.
Right.
So he would be teaching the same things.
Right. In much the same thing.
Yeah,
Yes.
but it's only recorded in the Matthew section because why would we record everything Jesus said every time he said it?
Right.
See, there would be no reason to do that. It's preserved. And so it just makes sense.
But Luke, he didn't necessarily record it in that particular instant,
Correct.
but he recorded it later on.
Correct.
Right.
Well, Luke was writing to a Gentile audience that did not know the law. And in Matthew's writing to the Jews who knew the law, so they needed a lot of clarification on the misunderstandings, which we find later in the book of Matthew as well, where Jesus says, "You've heard it's been said, I say to you." And so there was a lot of clarifications on their misunderstandings of the law. That was one reason why such an extension or an extended lesson as far as the Sermon on the Mount.
Okay. Thank you. I'm glad we have it, though. It's a great, great message. Okay. Matthew 8, 5 through 13, and Luke 7, 1 through 10 talks about Jesus healing a centurion's servant. I'm trying to do this as much chronologically as I can. So having concluded his Sermon on the Mount, Luke 7:1 indicates that Jesus left the mountain and entered back into the city of Capernaum, which was kind of his home base. Soon thereafter, Matthew 8:5-6 records that a certain centurion who had heard about the healing power of Jesus, no doubt, came to Jesus asking him to heal his servant who was lying at home paralyzed and dreadfully tormented. Luke 7:3-4 relates that the centurion did not personally go to Jesus, but he sent elders of the Jews to Jesus to plead with him to come and heal the centurion's servant who was sick and ready to die. The elders also gave the centurion a glowing recommendation. They said he was a very deserving individual, that he loved the Jewish nation, and that he had built for the Jews a synagogue. So when Jesus heard this, he willingly went with the elders to the home of the centurion. But when he neared the house, friends of the centurion met Jesus and gave this message. In Luke 7:6.
Sorry about that.
In Luke 7, still not there?
Yeah, just give me a couple minutes, I'm sorry.
I'll speak up a little bit.
Yep, no problem.
Okay. They gave Jesus this message from the centurion in Luke 7:6b-8. It says, Lord, do not trouble yourself, for I am not worthy.
It's not gonna work either, Ronnie.
Oh, okay. Let's start over. Lord, do not trouble yourself, for I am not worthy that you should enter under my roof. Therefore, I did not even think myself worthy to come to you. But say the word, and my servant will be healed, for I also am a man under authority, having soldiers under me. And I say to one, go, and he goes, and to another, come, and he comes, and to my servant, do this, and he does it. Wow. Jesus marveled at the faith of the centurion and said to the crowd that followed him in Luke 7:9, I say to you, I have not found such great faith, not even in Israel. And the message of Jesus to the centurion in Matthew 8:13 was, as you have believed, so let it be done for you. And when the friends of the centurion returned to the house, they found the servant well, who had been sick. After marveling about the centurion's great faith, Jesus makes another remarkable statement in Matthew 8:11-12. He said, and I say to you that many will come from east and west and sit down with Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob in the kingdom of heaven. But the sons of the kingdom will be cast out into outer darkness. There will be weeping and gnashing of teeth. Jesus says that many, like the centurion, will come from the east and west to sit down in the kingdom of heaven with Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. Jesus is referring to the gathering in of the Gentile nations into the earthly kingdom, the church, through the preaching of the gospel. And ultimately, that earthly kingdom will be gathered together into the heavenly kingdom at the Lord's second coming. And faithful believers of all nations will sit down, they will rest in that heavenly kingdom with Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. And that certainly is a wow statement for us, because we're part of those who were gathered in from the east and from the west. And if we are faithful, we will eventually sit down with Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob in heaven. Now, the sons of the kingdom makes reference to the nation of Israel, through whom the kingdom was promised and through whom Jesus descended. But the great majority of Jews rejected Jesus as their Messiah. And because of their rejection, they will be punished and cast into outer darkness, where there will be weeping and gnashing of teeth. They will not be privileged to sit down with Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob in heaven. Okay, let's look at Luke 7:11 through 17. Jesus raises the son of the widow of Nain. Luke 7:11 says that on the day following the healing of the centurion's servant, Jesus journeyed to the city of Nain. Many of Jesus' disciples went with him, and a large crowd followed as well. And Jesus came near the gate to Nain. And as he came near, he witnessed a funeral procession of a man being carried to the site of his burial. The deceased man was the only son of his widowed mother, and the funeral procession was attended by a large crowd of mourners from the city. Notice the reading in Luke 7:13 through 14. When the Lord saw her, the widow, he had compassion on her and said to her, "Do not weep." Then he came and touched the open coffin, and those who carried him stood still. And he said, "Young man, I say to you, arise." So he who was dead sat up and began to speak, and he presented him to his mother. Wow. Jesus had compassion upon this widowed mother, and he asked her not to weep. Then he touched that open coffin, and he commanded the young man to arise. And the man sat up and spake. And Jesus presented that young man alive to his mother. Wow. Luke 7:15 relates that fear or awe came upon all those who witnessed this great miracle. And they glorified God, saying, "A great prophet has risen up among us, and God has visited his people." And the report of this great miracle went throughout all Judea and the surrounding regions. So that was a wonderful story of Jesus raising the son of the widow of Nain. Let's look at now at some impenitent cities are being reproached by Jesus. Matthew 11:20 through 24, and Luke 10:13 and 14. Matthew 11:20 says that Jesus began to rebuke the cities in which most of his mighty works had been done because they did not repent. Jesus begins by pronouncing woe on Chorazin and Bethsaida, and then he pronounced woe upon his home city of Capernaum. I've got a map, I believe. Hopefully you can see that. Now, if you look at the map, Chorazin, Bethsaida, and Capernaum were located on the northern shore of the Sea of Galilee. Capernaum was on the northwest shore. Bethsaida was just east of Capernaum, and Chorazin was 2 miles north of Capernaum in the hills. Now, this represented an area where Jesus did a substantial amount of preaching and where Jesus performed most of his miracles. Now, he's going to talk about Tyre and Sidon in just a minute. Tyre and Sidon were ancient ports of Phoenicia. They are now located in modern Lebanon on the Mediterranean coast. Hopefully you see where Tyre and Sidon are located. These cities came into existence around 2000 BC, and we have several Old Testament prophecies predicting their destruction. Those prophecies are found mostly in Ezekiel 26 through 28 and Isaiah 23. Now, Tyre was completely destroyed by Alexander the Great in 322 BC. And Sidon was conquered in 346 BC by the Persian king or Xerxes. That's hard to say. Later, both cities recovered from their devastation. And at the time of the Roman rule, they had again become prosperous provinces of Rome. But the Jews obviously knew well, they were well aware of their earlier destruction of Tyre and Sidon. Now, Tyre and Sidon were Gentile cities north of Israel. And we've already mentioned a couple times during Jesus' ministry where crowds from Tyre and Sidon came to hear and to be healed by Jesus. Let's notice Matthew 11, 21 through 22. It says, "Woe to you, Chorazin! Woe to you, Bethsaida! For if the mighty works which were done in you had been done in Tyre and Sidon, they would have repented long ago in sackcloth and ashes. But I say to you, it will be more tolerable for Tyre and Sidon in the day of judgment than for you." Wow. In pronouncing woe upon Chorazin and Bethsaida, Jesus indicates that Tyre and Sidon would have repented of their wickedness in sackcloth and ashes had they witnessed the mighty works that Jesus had done in Chorazin and Bethsaida. And Jesus indicates that it would be no more tolerable for Tyre and Sidon on the day of judgment than for Chorazin and Bethsaida. Jesus even pronounced a woe upon his adopted home city of Capernaum. Notice Matthew 11, 23 through 24. "And you, Capernaum, who are exalted to heaven, will be brought down to Hades. For if the mighty works which were done in you had been done in Sodom, it would have remained until this day. But I say to you that it shall be more tolerable for the land of Sodom in the day of judgment than for you." And that's a wow statement. Remember how wicked Sodom was. You see, Jesus referred to Capernaum as being exalted to heaven. Why? Because it was uniquely honored to be the headquarters of Jesus' ministry, a city where he performed a substantial amount of miracles, a city where he frequently preached. But Jesus says that their exalted position will be brought down to Hades. That is, they will be destroyed. Why? Because had the mighty works which were done in Capernaum been done in Sodom, Jesus says they would have repented. And it would have remained until the day of Jesus. I think you certainly will remember that Sodom was demolished by fire and brimstone because of their wickedness in the days of Abraham. And Jesus again indicates that it would be more tolerable for Sodom on the day of judgment than for Capernaum. Any comments? I actually finished. Like I said, that we have 2 more Sundays of wow moments in the story of Jesus. And then I don't know what Mark is going to do. I don't know if he knows yet. But okay. He's going to be teaching beginning in June. Thank you for your attention.